Some time ago, I found this document. It was alleged to have come from the CIA archive. Now, whatever you want to say about intelligence, these matters, the Central Intelligence Agency has a website specifically attempting to attract minor children. It's called Spy Kids. There was an exhibit at a public museum in Houston. It was called Spy Kids. I did not know at the time that the Central Intelligence Agency actually had an online forum called Spy Kids. It's absolutely 100% contemptible and unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. Nonetheless, before I found this Spy Kids website, I found a document alleged to have come from the CIA archives online that discusses matters it was written by a person purporting himself to be some sort of historian. And it discusses the 13 satanic bloodlines. And prominent families throughout the United States, including families that had international familial connections. And I was reading this, and I said to myself, what if you were somebody that at some point had been determined to be in lineage with one of these satanic bloodlines? I read through almost all of the document. I think I read through the entire document, actually. And I was trying to figure out at what point did they make the commitment to Satanism? Where was the evidence that they had committed themselves to being Satanist? You know, there were discussions of particular kinds of practices, including understanding of a sacrifice of the firstborn. That there was a commitment certain families had to sacrificing the firstborn, including the firstborn girl child, as a offering to the satanic realm in order to provide the blood buy-in for the rest of the family, or at least the family line of that generation, so far as it was communicated. But by and large, a majority of the connections substantiating them as somehow being satanic had to do with having a legacy of being Jewish. That there was something specific and distinct about having a family line that at some point in time had maintained and persisted in commitment to a older family line identified as Jewish, including one that may or may not have been in a position of relative advantage or opportunity within the context of the rest of the Jewish community and its experience of persecution at various points in time, including and especially from certain parts of the world that at various points in time were identified and targeted for massive pogroms or even all-out extermination. I said to myself, why is this on the CIA archives? What other things has the CIA put in its archive that it uses as some form of slanderous underwriting and then just may or may not allow to be made accessible through some public search function? Now, my understanding is that as time has gone on, that what happens is at various times there is some sort of activity and it involves the intercession of the State Department. Apparently, there are actually laws about how the Department of State may actually engage in domestic matters, including around specific kinds of international commercial activity, specifically related to the energy sector, and more specific than that, the gas and oil sector. But then other things that may or may not have to intercede through or be connected to some sort of diplomatic channels. Those laws and those protocols and those processes should be 100% public and explicit. The Department of State is supposed to be about more than just finding a way to defraud other departments in order to provide insurance for CIA activities, right? And so at various points in time, what I've noticed is that there is a major deal, presumably, at least publicly acknowledged, as being connected to the private sector, but being brokered through entities that are now identified as being in the private sector that previously had substantial shareholders in actual Congress, i.e. Congress was a primary shareholder in their entity for a period of time, while presumably they were going through some sort of bailout. And while there was an explicitly identified process regarding how it was that certain financial institutions or certain institutions actually had the relationship through Treasury with the Congress that they did, what they didn't tell us about is how those companies were allowed to identify certain actual individuals and their human capital as their assets to be used to launder theirs during the time frame wherein the Congress was actually operating as a major shareholder, if not the controlling shareholder. And now we are where we are. And what I've seen in the last 2 years is that specific periods of time, these private entities are identified as having some sort of financial trouble and having a problem in the financial markets. And when they do, all of a sudden, for a temporary period of time, there is very significant material available and a very specific kind of identification associated with the CIA archives as they're available electronically. I've noticed this at least 4 times. And not only did I notice this at least 4 times, but it concurred with there being information, at least that I was allowed to be exposed to, publicly. Other people picking up on currents connected to the information I was finding in the CIA archives online. Now, this is not about me being involved in intelligence. This is not about me being a classified asset that somebody else gets to claim for their electoral campaign. Because ultimately, this is what I've seen over and over again as well. Is this isn't about actual statecraft. And it isn't about actual legislation. And it isn't about actually policy making. And it isn't even about identifying that I might present some sort of threat, or I might present a risk too great in order to allow me to actually participate in ordinary political process, much less a more formal political process. This is basically about somebody using their campaign activities to set up a very specific hedging strategy they expect to be able to accomplish during their term. And then they just identify people to do the work for them so they can claim the credit and then contract it out while they're in public office. And it is a violation of not only the 14th Amendment, but also the 5th and the 13th Amendments. Period. And depending upon what they intend to do with you, it's also a violation of the 2nd Amendment. And we've got a very, very significant deficiency when it comes to constitutional application in this country. Now, I just encountered something, and I don't know, really, because of the manners in which you allow for information to intentionally be manipulated, right? And you won't talk about it honestly. You want to say it has something to do with hacking. It's not about hacking. And when you call it hacking, again, you're reinforcing this concept of victimization. And that's not what it's about. There are other countries that discuss the understanding they have about information warfare and what it means. And they don't just refine it, and they just don't confine it to the equivalent of their Central Intelligence Agency. And that's what this is. So let's get the information that we need to be dealing with right now on the record, today. Right now, there is a representation that there was a defector from the former Soviet Union who at one point in time would have been what I guess would be the equivalent of chief of staff to Joseph Stalin. And one of the things he did was take notes, or rather minutes, from the meetings that were held. It says that at a certain point in time, he defected from the Soviet Union. He didn't die until the 80s. And in the course of his life, he maintained some of his notebooks. And at some point, it was discovered that he had a notebook regarding a meeting that was one of the last meetings that was held involving the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. And in that meeting, it had been discussed how Vladimir Lenin wanted to see Leon Trotsky be the person to step up into fulfilling the role that he had within both the Bolshevik Party, but also within the other activities of the Soviet Union. And then, as is reflected in the minutes from this meeting, Trotsky declined because he was a Jew. And he didn't want the Soviet Union to be represented as having a Jew in leadership at that time that could then subject the Soviet Union to anti-Semitism. Now, it's very well known these days, in certain circles, what happened to Leon Trotsky following the death of Lenin, right? How he ended up where he did, what ended up happening to him. Some people know about his travels in between, including the very specific relationship he personally had with political organizing within the United States, including political organizing that wanted to take his ideas and wanted to take his praxis or his recommendations for praxis and apply it for themselves in their context at a time where he explicitly said he did not support its application. He did not support the application of his political inclinations, his understanding of what could be possible, his theories for how to organize and implement and to engage strategically. He did not support it because the material conditions were not available at the time, and to have engaged it prematurely would have inherently set it up for failure. But there were other people that agreed and liked his strategy, and they decided to apply it in his stead. They went through and tried to apply his strategy themselves in a completely different context, by the way, than the one within which that strategy was developed. What ended up happening to Trotsky? Well, that's one thing. What ended up happening to the movement that took his strategy and attempted to apply it? Specifically, particular individuals within that particular effort, right? And if you know about that history, you may or may not talk about it, and you may or may not try to project on other people some aspersion cast upon them because you have identified their response to what you're doing as somehow being comparable. Okay, all right. Is it true? Is it true that it was kept confidential for years? That the reason that Trotsky did not step up to replace Lenin upon his death was because he understood not so much anti-Semitism within the Soviet Union, but anti-Semitism everywhere else, including from the United States, including from other countries presumably allied with the ambitions of the Soviet Union in its nascent days. I'm going to do something here, and it's not a flip. I'm going to read from a transcript of a congressional hearing. Testimony of James Warburg, Vice Chairman of the Bank of Manhattan Company, and Professor Edwin Kemmerer, Princeton University, on the Banking Act of 1935. Hearings before a subcommittee of the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, 74th Congress, first session. This is what it says. Quote, "It seems to me quite obvious that a phenomenon such as a worldwide economic depression has its origin in a multiplicity of causes. In the case of this depression, causes which seem to me linked very largely to the waste, dislocations, and strains incident to the World War and to the failures of political governments everywhere. It seems to me quite obvious that in the face of what has happened in the world since August 1914, no banking system in this country could have been able to stand the strain of the Depression." Governor Eccles goes on to say that the banking system of this country has been unable to lend effective support in the fight against the Depression. If he is referring to 1932 and early 1933, I agree with him. If he is referring to the banking system as it is today, I must disagree. The banking system today is glutted with billions of idle dollars waiting for business and industry to come and borrow them. It does not follow, however, that I consider our banking system a perfect system or even a good system, nor that I am opposed to making changes in it. On the contrary, I testified over a year ago before this committee and before the House Committee on Coinage, Weights, and Measures as to the need for thoroughgoing reform of our banking system. The point I wish to make is that even if we had had a better banking system, we should at best have avoided the ultimate spasms of collapse, and then only if we had had better business and political leadership than that which guided the destinies of our nation in the post-war decade. The second point I wish to make is this. Granting the need of banking reform, which no one admits more readily nor has urged more assiduously than I, it does not follow that what is now proposed is the right answer to our problem. Governor Eccles says, quote, "The principal measures contemplated in the proposed legislation, therefore, are designed to remedy deficiencies now inherent in the banking structure itself," end quote. Taken in connection with the rest of the governor's statement and in connection with the bill he proposes, it would seem that the deficiencies now inherent in the banking structure consist largely in, one, a lack of complete control by the political administration over the operations of the Federal Reserve System, at least insofar as these operations affect the national interest, and two, in the existence of certain superfluous restrictions upon the extension of credit by the Federal Reserve banks and by these commercial banks. These, it would seem, are the deficiencies which the proposed bill seeks to remedy. Now, I'm quoting this here, this excerpt. There's more to it. This is actually a very, very, very important testimony before Congress. He brings up a lot of very, very important provocative points very directly. And it's not so dissimilar from things that one can see in more recent American history, including in regards to very important congressional hearing processes associated with the banking and financial sector, but also associated with the accounting sector, right? And how at these points in time, there is intercession between people that are professionals in their field, including controversial professionals, and elected leadership, discussing practical application of policy that presumably is created and implemented by the legislature and approved by the president, and at least insofar as it's allowed to stay on the record as law, not voted down as being unconstitutional by the judicial branch. And so when these moments happen, when these people come and they give testimony before Congress and they provide their professional understanding of what's going on, and they come up with an understanding that they present to the public for the public record, this is also part of the value that we have in this country as the people. This is not just there for individuals that have found a way to get their preferred candidate elected for a specific period of time, to then claim as theirs, to use as risk credit to gamble with the rest of our lives. And part of that gambling has to do with aspersions that are cast on people based upon arbitrary ascribements of demography and demographics. There has been a debate within this country that gets silenced more and more as the years go on, as it gets normalized under a sort of pseudo-scientific justification regarding eugenics and the completely unacceptable manner in which eugenicists have been allowed to misrepresent what is identifiable as actual self-determination based upon one's self-interest. When you allow for a racial ascribement or an ethnic ascribement that predeterministically identifies political possibilities for people based on their ethnography or their demography, you are cutting off their capacity to actually engage in their own rights, their own unalienable rights, to be able to be informed of decisions and to make decisions that actually represent their self-interest. In the course of this, what are you doing if insofar as you're trying to use these various systems that we have at work in our country or around the world to effectuate some sort of administration or some sort of implementation and being able to get people access to their resources, if you're pre-programming and predeterministically deciding based upon your identification of what their racial or ethnic heritage is, what their possibilities are allowed to be. Racially typecasting people so that then you can set up quotas in a system where people are used as speculation on somebody else's financial strategy without their consent and without any accountability to them, it's completely unconscionable. And I already know from my own personal review that these are not modern issues. These are not issues that just came up in the last 10, 20, 30 years. These issues go all the way back to the founding of the United States and even before the founding of the United States. And it's not isolated to the United States of America. I bring this up because James Warburg was the son of Paul Warburg. And part of what Paul Warburg did was attempt to reconcile differences between the specific manner in which the American banking system developed and its need to be able to do commerce with banking systematologies that were much, much older than the one the United States was trying to engage. And the question needs to be asked now, and it needs to be followed through on. Did the European banking systems, including the specific houses within the European system, the Dutch houses, the other houses of Europe outside of the United Kingdom or Britain at the time, have a long-standing policy related to modalities associated with conversion of Jews? And was this part of a systematology that has been going on for hundreds of years that was expected for the United States to assimilate into in order to be validated as being on par with the kind of commercial engagements that had been going on through the European system. See, if we as the United States agreed to co-conspire with that, even if there were people that were of Jewish descent or that had a specific role in that economy because they had been involved in banking and commerce for a very long period of time, where they provided a specific relationship between what was going on in their communities and the ways that their communities could access resources based upon an engagement with a purview or a worldview that had isolated or had segregated Jews, then this is one thing to deal with. But if we agreed to mimic this strategy and or try to refine it in order to serve certain kinds of political opportunism within our country, including ones that violate our founding precepts against persecution regarding religious affiliation, including ones that have to do with an understanding that we still have the burden to deal with of the 3/5 compromise and how that impacted what happened with the constitutional process and everything since, then we have to do it. We can't put the work off onto someone else or blame someone else or just try to make sure we refine our education system and or underwrite insurance to cover up for selectively identifying people that are allowed to be the quota filled within that community for a particular kind of liquidation in a racist and eugenicist scheme. This is what I understand to be the last year of the pre-existing Libra rate from a particular kind of banking modality that has been allowed to, by and large, provide a primary modus through which decisions regarding finance and commerce, including internationally, has been decided for a substantial amount of time. If the Libra index is based upon a Jewish conversion scam, where regardless of whether someone is actually Jewish, but unfortunately, I'm pretty certain at a certain level, it does require a Jewish pedigree in order to be authenticated, that they need to be liquidated and they need to be murdered so that their assets can be converted into whatever is decided to be the acceptable conversion. There's absolutely no way we can let this stand. And I'm sorry, I don't really care how many people consider themselves to be in lineage as part of a pedigree Jewish family that has been able to get some exception. Why? Because of the Kennedy curse and what I think it really means. And because even if you don't want to accept that I have that Jewish pedigree, you made me the Jew way too many fucking times to let anybody else get away with this. You made me the black. You made me specifically the mulatto woman. You made me the Hispanic. You made me the wetback. You did these things to me. And I'm not choosing one to perform in one stead of the other in order to try to find somebody to replace me so I can move on down the pipeline. It's done. This has gone on too long. There were too many other alternatives that happened throughout the 20th century that we could have engaged in and we could have created together as some sort of process of being able to move forward on our political destiny, either locally or nationally or internationally. And this has been intentionally bankrupted by people that have refused to be honest with their own accounting. If you didn't already murder enough Jews to cover your ass to this point, I'm sorry. It's done. And so we're going to have to figure out what to do instead. And in order to figure out what to do instead, we're going to have to expose what's already happened to this point, and we're also going to have to recover what we already had available. The Federal Reserve System had what relationship to the administration of TARP and TALF funds following the 2008 banking bailout? What was the relationship specifically between the Federal Reserve and what Congress was supposed to be doing when it provided oversight of the Department of Treasury in the administration of TARP and TALF funds? The understanding was that Congress made a very specific decision about what to do with TARP and TALF at its onset. But it was through the leadership at the Treasury that it was allowed to be redefined and refocused to get us to where we are now. What was the relationship between the Federal Reserve, its manner in which it disproportionately influenced policy regarding Treasury implementation of what was supposed to be a congressional mandate, and the Congress that was officiating the implementation of the 2008 banking bailout reform package, including TARP and including TALF later on. We haven't answered those questions. And we're going to need to answer those questions and deal with them directly in order to be honest about the failure it is the Affordable Care Act. Do you understand? And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're proud of who you are and where you come from, I look forward to being able to engage with you and sharing your culture as you feel appropriate. But there's no room for racial quotas here. There's no room for ethnic quotas here. And there's certainly no room for a pre-designed archetype of what is allowed to be tolerated as an appropriate ethnic or racial expression. If you have the capacity to articulate the political issue, then that's one thing. But don't come in and tell me I gotta play white if I'm gonna get to the table. I have no problem sitting on the floor. And if you won't join me, then I'll take it from you.